Good morning, church. My name is Gary Lepine, and I am a member here at Bow Valley, and I have the honor to bring you some words and thoughts this morning. I have mentioned to a number of you before that for my day job, I work for Alberta Health Services as a clinical ethicist. What this means is I come alongside patients and their families and healthcare providers and help them navigate the ethical issues that are often a part of their healthcare decisions. Some of these conversations are fairly straightforward. Some of them are incredibly challenging, especially when you get near the end of somebody's life and they're trying to wrestle with what they are supposed to do. And what I've discovered is as different, and I think this is why I like the job, because it's all over the place, which is kind of me. Right? So it's never the same. It's always different. Every week is different. Every consult is different, and I think I enjoy that. But there's one common thread throughout all of them, is every patient that I've ever talked to wants to make a good choice, the right choice. And every family member wants to make a good choice, the right choice for their loved one. And every healthcare provider that I've ever worked with wants to do their very best. They want to do good work. They want to provide good care, whatever that looks like and however they struggle to make that a reality. It's just built in. They just want to do it right. Now, of course, there's a whole medical side to this. What's the right medical choice and all of that? I have nothing to do with that whatsoever. Have no clue. Not my background. My job is to talk about the values piece of it, the ethics piece of it. Often when I'm doing this, I'll have someone ask me, so what kind of training did you have to do to get this job? Right? Yeah, exactly. And so there's lots of different ways. It's kind of an interesting long story that I will not bore you with this today. We all come at it from different perspectives and different disciplines, et cetera. There's quite the variety of us in the field. But there is one thread for all of us that all of us, somewhere along the line, have done a significant amount of formal education in the area of ethics, which means studying philosophy, and in my case, also theology. When I share that, that's when I get the glassy-eyed look, like, oh, really? I did a philosophy class once. It was awful. Hated it. My oldest daughter would share this sentiment. Maddie is a makeup artist esthetician, but during her earlier career, she was doing some university classes, and I tried to convince her, I guess I convinced her to do a philosophy class, and she chose a philosophy of education class, I think it was. And I was sitting with some colleagues at lunch one day, and I got a text message from her that said, "Philosophy is the stupidest thing ever. How did you do an entire degree in this stuff?" And we kind of talked, and I said, some of us are amazed we got jobs doing this stuff, to be honest with you. It's odd. I have rubbed off on my kids a little bit, though, I have noticed. A while back, we were all sitting at the dinner table. Sam and Sarah, twins, were about 15, and Sam being Sam, if you've ever met Sam, you know what I'm talking about. Sam being Sam, just out of the blue says, do you remember that Calvin and Hobbes comic strip where Calvin wonders, what if God's just a big chicken? Like, what if we get to heaven and God's just a big chicken? And there's a pause, and Sarah says, well, then I guess we know the chicken came first. I might have teared up a little bit, to be honest with you. I was so proud. Not your average dinner conversation. Now, my point for all of this is, I get it. Philosophy, theology is not everybody's cup of tea. It's very abstract. We have conversations that most people probably do not want to have. But here's my contention. We all do it all the time. You are theologians. You are philosophers. You may not recognize it, you may not do it, but you do it all the time. So I was trying to figure out how to demonstrate this, so I found an exercise. You've done this exercise before, so we're going to give it a whirl and try it again. We did this a couple weeks ago at our leadership thing. It's not all that challenging. And okay, so for my fellow introverts, breathe. You will be okay. It's some audience participation. You will be fine. I'm not going to ask you to talk to anybody. I will ask you to perhaps raise your hand if you would like to, right? Extroverts, this is your moment, okay? Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to give you a choice, and I just want to see hands, okay? Coffee or tea? Who are my coffee drinkers? Who are my tea drinkers? Yeah, we're always outnumbered, kind of thing. Okay, let's push it a little bit. Dogs or cats? Oh, who are my dog people? And who are my cat people? Interesting. Okay, all right. Let me try this one. I'm curious about this one. Wash the dishes right away or let them soak for a bit first? Wash them right away? Let them soak. Yeah, there's some side eyes going with this one kind of thing, yeah. All right, we're going to get some. Okay, that was fun. All right. All right, let me push a little bit more. Spend or save? Spend? Save. This will get some conversations going. Steve will never ask me to preach again. I'll just like, okay, let me do the real philosophical one. This is the one. Are people inherently good or inherently evil? Inherently good? Inherently evil. Oh, now we're getting it. See, this is why I don't get invited to parties, because nobody wants to have this conversation at all. Now, my guess is this, because I've done this exercise a number of times, and here's my guess of what was going on in your head. Some of you had no problem. You're like, absolutely. You had a definite answer, right? One of those were your definite go-to, right? You knew this. But I'm also willing to bet that there were a number where you went, wait a minute, I don't like either of those. I don't want coffee or tea. I'm more of a cold beverage person, right? And you started to, wait, or that. Or when I said dogs or cats, you would say, well, I like both. Or I like neither. I don't want a pet, right? Or the whole wash the dishes thing, right? Some of you have figured out, wait a minute, I may let it soak, but if I wait long enough, the person who wants to do it right away will go ahead and do it, and I get out of the task. Yeah, there we go, right? See, it's nuance, it's different, spend, save, and the whole good-evil bit. See, if you are probably, what you're thinking is, it's not that simple sometimes. Choosing the good, the right, what's best is complicated, it's nuance. I think it should be simple, but it really isn't. And here we go. And this is why I have a day job, and this is why I like it so much, because you have these kinds of conversations all the time. And you do this all the time. You can't help but do that. Now, there's a reason why I'm sharing all this with you. Our text for this morning, we've been working through the fruit of the Spirit. And it just, Steve asked, can you preach, et cetera, and he just assigned to me goodness. And I thought, well, this will be fun, because what do you do with this? So what I want to do, and I hope you just stick with me for just a few moments, I want to do some theology with you. Because without the theology, when we get to Galatians, I don't think we can truly appreciate the magnitude of what Paul is sharing in his letter to the Galatians unless we know the whole full, or get a glimpse of the backstory, the theology of what's going on behind the scenes. So I know, summer, this is not what you came for, but just give me a moment. And I really want to end up with one point. There's only one thing I want you to walk away with. And it'll take me a bit to get there. I will get there. But just hang on for just a second. And I think you do this already. I have shared a quote with you before, about a year and a half ago, but I want to share it with you again. I have this quote typed out on a piece of paper. It's taped to the back of my desk, so I see it every day. And it anchors very much my work, and it's come to anchor my very existence. I live my life this way. And it's this quote by Alistair MacIntyre, who was both a philosopher and a theologian, who taught at the University of Notre Dame. And in a rather large, frustratingly complex book, he makes this quote: I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. And what he means by that is you can't begin to answer the question, what's the right choice? What do I ought to do? What should I do? Until you've answered the first question, but what do I believe about the world? What's the big story that I'm a part of that drives this? And he also recognized, notice the plural, the stories, but there's also lots of littler, smaller stories, sub-stories that are part of this bigger story. And as we go through this, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time with the big story. That's what theology does. So let me walk you through just very quickly some big pieces, and I'll eventually get to Galatians 5:23. So the first part of the theological story is actually found right at the beginning of the book. If you open your Bible and you go to Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you find the creation account, right? Two different aspects to God's creating the earth. And when you work through it, and there's lots of details there, obviously, but when you read through, especially chapter 1, there's a pattern that starts to evolve. God creates something, he takes a step back and looks and says it's good. And then when he gets to the very end of the story, he says, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Now, why is this so significant? For a number of reasons. The first is this. According to this, see, what's unique about there's lots of creation accounts. If you go back, there are lots of stories about how the world came into existence. What's somewhat unique about the biblical narrative, the Christian narrative, the Judeo-Christian narrative, is that it was done with purpose, with intent. It was orderly. It was good. Which is rather different because most of the stories, creation came about chaotically, without purpose, and was a battle between good and evil. And that's not the biblical story at all. The biblical story is very much founded in the idea that a good God created with purpose and order and intent. And then he looked at it and he said, it was very good. So in other words, this sense of order and purpose, a sense of how things ought to be, is the very fabric of our story and our world. And it's built because God is there. It comes from God. God is the definition of good. Now, there's lots of flow out of that. Us, being created in the image of God, share that. We are meant for a purpose. See, part of the idea when God said it was good, part of it, it was pleasing to him, which is fascinating. He enjoyed it. He looked at his creation and said, wow, that's awesome. That's good. I like that. But he also had the sense of that it was fit for a purpose, that there was a reason. It flowed. There was an intent behind it. And that's us. We were created for a purpose. There's an ought to our existence. Jesus reaffirms this. He jumped way ahead. And in one of his many encounters, a ruler comes up to him and says, good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus' first response is, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Now, there's a number of things potentially going on here. Some have commented that really what Jesus is doing here, in part, is hinting at his own divinity, right? That people are starting to acknowledge there's something unique about this certain rabbi. Perhaps, but at the very least, what Jesus is doing here is affirming what had been anchored in this story for centuries. Only God is good. God anchors what is good. And we share in that goodness inasmuch as we share our relationship with God. Okay? Now, there's some yeah buts that are starting to creep in, right? Because it doesn't stay there, does it? There's the second part of this whole theology story, and it comes in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, where things go sideways. This is when, quote, we call it the fall. Sin enters the world. And it actually, the flow in the story, see, if you go back and you read the first couple of chapters, there is a tree that represents the knowledge of good and evil. Notice that, right, in the text, right? And Adam and Eve are not supposed to eat of it. In other words, they are fit for a purpose. Their purpose is, as a creation, not the creator. They are not the definition and author of goodness, right? They are an expression of it. But the temptation is to change that. The temptation is to now, but wait a minute, maybe I ought to be the author of good. Maybe I should be the one who gets to decide what's right and wrong. Maybe I'm the one who should make this decision. And that's what they choose. And from Genesis chapter 3, right through the entire biblical story, until you get to the end in Revelation chapters, the last chapters of Revelation, right? you see a world that has changed the order of events. That goodness is now defined by any number of other ways other than perhaps what God is. And it's huge, and it's impactful. And it is our entire experience with goodness. Is it not? See, notice in McIntyre's quote, he talks about all, like, what story or stories you find yourself a part of. See, each of us has a story, right? Each of us has our own story. And it's the story usually heavily tainted and influenced by Genesis chapter 3. Things have not unfolded entirely the way you have expected. Would that be a fair statement? Would it be fair to say that we look at the world today and think, oh, it sure doesn't feel like there's a lot of goodness? I know of individuals that I've had some conversation with that would take great umbrage with what I have just said about God being the author of goodness, et cetera, because they take a look and say, how on earth can you believe in a good God when a fire goes through Jasper? How can you believe in a good God when all this stuff is going on? It's a great question. It's an incredibly challenging question. But the anchor is still very much in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And we can toy with that, but that's kind of another message. But it's the yeah buts that we struggle with, and it's where our individual stories wrestle with most. Now, there are some answers found within that part of the text. And this is what we're leading into Galatians. See, one of them, the major response to what does goodness look like now after sin has entered the world, and God, it's the law, right? So God is frustratingly patient in how he develops this, is he not? It takes generations, years, centuries to unfold. He calls Abraham, people, they start to do their thing. They're enslaved, et cetera, and you come to Exodus, and they're brought out of Egypt, and they're given a law, that 10 commandments. See, when people talk about goodness, where do you go to first? Those 10 commandments, because they're kind of important, and they are. One person put it this way, that the 10 commandments describe for us, in a way, the things that are closest to God's heart. Powerful way of putting it. But notice what happens. Those 10 commandments become 613 additional commandments. And those 613 additional commandments become a myriad of other expectations and laws and requirements and et cetera, and it goes on. And so much of the biblical story is about a nation of people who struggled with fulfilling this law. Now, part of what went with that law was a sacrificial system that acknowledged that no matter how good you were, you could not possibly fulfill all the requirements of that law. It was impossible to do. Then why give it? Which brings us to Galatians. Okay? Galatians is an interesting letter because it's probably Paul's first letter. It's very early. It's about 50-ish AD. So it's only 15 to 20 years after the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. And it's to one of the early churches that Paul helped establish. And they would have been predominantly Jewish. They came from a Jewish background. And for centuries, their entire life was built around the law, fulfilling the law. This is what it meant to be a good person. You had to fulfill the law. And when you couldn't fulfill the law, you had a sacrificial system that would take care of that. And this is what it meant to be, right, a believer in God. And then this Jesus person shows up and just rattles the foundation. Now notice, Jesus isn't just random. He shows up, again, by purpose and design. Number of places throughout the Old Testament where it said, one will come where? All of this will pass. One of my favorite passages where it says, I will give you not a law written on stone tablets, but one written on your heart. Not one made of stone, but one made of spirit. And this Jesus. And so when Jesus shows up, that's the conversation. Is Jesus of Nazareth the one? The one who will fulfill all this? And the answer for many was yes. This is why we talk about being disciples of Jesus, because we believe he was the one who fulfilled the law and fulfilled the sacrificial system, so we don't have to do that anymore. If you want to get a taste of what that might have been like, go back and reread Exodus Deuteronomy and Leviticus all over again. Not probably your daily read, but you'll get a glimpse of what was involved. It must have been exhausting. Jesus fulfills all that. Now, this is what's going on in Galatia. They have accepted this. They have come to the realization that they do not have to do this anymore. Jesus has fulfilled this. I am now a disciple of Jesus. The law requirements, the sacrificial system, all fulfilled in him, and that's the thing. But what's happening in Galatia is they are struggling with that transition. Because for centuries, their descendants, have done things a certain way. This is what religion looked like. This is what faith looked like. And now you're telling me I don't have to do that? Sounds good, but I'm not sure I believe you. It's hard. And they're struggling with it. Now, Paul's letter to Galatia, it's very blunt. It's somewhat harsh. He doesn't hold back. He has some rather strong language in there about what's going on. And he makes it very pointed. He said, you're not just doing a small thing. The moment you deny that Jesus is the only answer to this, you are way off base. Not a little off base, completely off base. You are denying what Jesus did the moment you add anything to it. Now, it's easy to look back, and I think there's a number of things that happen where we get, oh, stupid people, why would they want to go back and do all that stuff? It's right there. This should be easier. They're free in Christ, right? And they should embrace this, and why are we having this conversation? And you're looking and thinking, I probably don't have issues with this. Pause for just a second. Don't shoot me. Just listen. Don't have to answer this question. Don't raise hands. How many of you sit in the same place every Sunday morning? Me, right there, every Sunday. I like it. It's familiar. It's safe. I'm an introvert. When they ask me to stand up and shake somebody's hand, I already know the people. I'm good. I don't have to meet new people. Works fantastic. Right? This just hit me this morning. See, I got here earlier than I normally do, and the parking lot was wide open. I always park in the same spot. And then as I was driving in, I thought, am I going to park in the same spot? No, I am free in Jesus. I'm going to park at a different spot. I'm wondering, though, whose spot I took and whether there's somebody here who's frustrated because they couldn't park in their spot. I don't know. We can have that conversation afterwards. We've got a bigger one coming up. Some of you, just stay with me. Because we want to fulfill our mission more at Bow Valley to help people find and follow Jesus, we are going to go to 2 services, 9 and 11. What do you mean? I've been going to church at 10 forever. You're going to ask me not to go to church at 10? Yes, 9 or 11. I don't know if I can do that. And I get it. And I know I'm being a little facetious, but I'm not. See, I guess what I'm pointing out is structure helps us. It's comfortable. We like it. There's an element where familiarity and those rules, they help us. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a little bit of understanding of what's happening in Galatia because for their entire lives there was a certain way of doing things and now they had to shift. Now, why is this so important? Well, because I think while we may not struggle with requirements of the law, things like circumcision and the sacrificial system and dietary laws, I wonder how many other things we struggle with and what this looks like for us today. My mom was truly one of the most gracious, kind, accepting people I ever knew. Truly, she was. She was also somewhat traditional in her beliefs about what faith should look like. I don't know this for a fact, but I am pretty sure she would be somewhat appalled by the fact that I am up here preaching in a short-sleeve shirt that is not tucked in. That would be, she would not be proud, I think. She also had views, for instance, playing pool was not what a good person did. Billiards, right? No, a good person did not play pool. And most certainly, a good person did not go to a pool hall to play pool. So you can imagine her consternation when she discovered that one of her sons was discovered playing pool in a pool hall. The fact that this son had skipped school to play pool in a pool hall didn't help matters all that much. And we had a lovely conversation about this because this is not what a good person did. And I wanted to point out to her, but in England, billiards is for the classy and that kind of thing. And even then you start, but what's happening here? And what's dawned on me is this, is sometimes the way we live out our Galatian moment is that cultural expectations of what church is supposed to look like become just as important as faith in Jesus. See, Paul's message is simply this. The moment it's Christ plus anything, we are off base. Let that sink in. Christ plus anything is off base. Read Galatians again, the entire letter, and it comes through loud and clear. It is Jesus and Jesus alone that makes us righteous before God. There isn't a thing we can do that makes us better, gooder in the eyes of God. It is Jesus and Jesus alone. Those of you who have lived in other parts of the world know this better than perhaps some of us. Because you start to realize there's lots of different ways to do church, isn't there? Lots of different ways. I remember trying to have this conversation with somebody. We were going to this. And he kind of got frustrated with me, and he said, I don't think you believe in absolutes. And I paused and said, oh, no, I do. I believe there's absolutely right and wrong. I just don't think there are as many as I once did. Because the longer you live, you start to realize the things that we have spent so much grief over, right, probably are not all that important, or they're not the most important. You might even be able to attend church at 9 or 11 and still be okay. I know it'll be challenged. It'll be challenged for me. You're probably going to be okay. I don't have this conversation often because it's a really tough conversation to have because it's incredibly personal, but you hear it. It's how many people do you know where they'll say, no, I'm not a believer anymore. I'm not a follower of Jesus anymore. It was too hard. Too difficult, too hard. And I wonder, and I don't know this, and I want to be very careful here because I don't want to, interpret somebody else's story, presume things about their story, but I've heard enough to wonder, was it belief in God that was too hard? Or was it the expectation of others that made it too hard? Right? Because so much of our history was built around a good person, a follower of Jesus, looks like this. Does all of this, doesn't do any of that, or has never done that. This gets hard, doesn't it? Challenging. Now, there's lots of pause here, and let me just address one, because I'm guessing there's buts going on in your head. But wasn't the law good? Again, things closest to God's heart. Absolutely. The law served a purpose. Paul does tell us in Galatians it was a tutor. It was meant to bring us to understand what he was doing in Jesus. And there's a lot of theology unpacked there. And I struggled with how do I share this with you, and this is what I've come to, and it actually comes out of my work, but also just as I pondered this. There are lots of important things. Like a lot of the examples I've given you, you would think, oh, those really aren't that big a deal, right? And yet we spent a lot of grief over, times and all that kind of stuff. But there are some huge issues that are of significant importance to how we live our lives. Absolutely, 100%, I'm not denying that. But in Paul's words, there may be lots of important things, but there is only one first thing. And that first thing is Jesus. So here is really the idea, the one idea that I want you to walk away with. See, we often usually ask, what must I do to be good? But I think the more biblical answer, the narrative, the more important question is, where must I be to be good? The order here is what is most important. In the biblical narrative, where you are matters more than what you do. What you do follows where you are. You are with God. You are in Jesus. And because of that, good things come. Good things flow. Which gets us specifically to Galatians 5, 22 and 23. Notice the language that he uses. The fruit of the Spirit is these things. You do these things. See, goodness flows out of. Henrik prayed this way. It's great to hear. And I know you're thinking this isn't such a big deal, but ponder it for just a second, right? Because again, how many people have struggled because it's too hard? Well, maybe the too hard is because you're trying to do good things that you'll never be able to pull off, instead of trusting in the one who allows you to be good. Trust is the issue, not effort. And if that settles on you, just ponder that for a moment. How many of us are just tired and weary of just trying to be good and failing? Because I'm not. How many of you have those moments where it's like, I messed up again. You think I'd get this right. I've been at this for a long time. Yes, and there's something to be said there. So let me just kind of give you some thoughts to play with as we wrap up. True goodness is fueled not by our efforts, but it begins with accepting God's presence in our lives. The order is most important. We were created, notice the theology, we were created for a purpose. Now, freedom isn't to do whatever you want. Paul addresses that. Just bump up a few verses ahead of the fruit of the Spirit. Because this is the yeah, but you're going, well, if that's true, I can do anything I want. No, Paul says. Because you wouldn't want to. You shouldn't. Because those things freedom isn't to do whatever you want. Freedom is to live according to the purpose that God has created you for. That is where true freedom lies, which is a very vastly different narrative than we usually hear day in and day out. Listen to the story we are told. In our part of the world, freedom is defined by being able to do whatever you want to do. That's freedom. Until you live that way and you realize it's not so free. It comes with all kinds of consequences, does it not? And that's God's point. And it's a different narrative. It's a tough narrative. But the order matters. It makes a difference. Our whole series, Steve has been asking, so what does the world need most? Well, I'm supposed to say goodness, because that's what he assigned me. But here's how I would phrase it. I think what the world, and no question, the world needs goodness. I don't know about you. You take a look, there's a lot of badness. But I don't think the world needs another new law. It doesn't need see, this is what happens. When bad stuff happens, we think, well, we got to have a law about that. I get it, makes sense. We like structure, familiarity, but I don't think that's what's going to work. Honestly, I think this is Paul's message. What the world needs now most is a goodness that flows from the outpouring of God's presence in the lives of those who are his people. The world doesn't need us to tell them how to live. The world needs us to show them God. And if God shows up in our lives, goodness oozes out. One final thought that leads us to communion. Because people say, well, what about, all these, isn't it good for me to pray, meditate, read God's word, fellowship with his people? Absolutely. Those are important things. But we do those things not to be good in the eyes of God. We do those things to draw into his presence, to invite him in, to hear, to listen, to let him convict and change and transform. This is how it played out for me. I was thinking about this. How do you transition from goodness into communion? I grew up, so some of you, you may be new to Bow Valley. You come from a different tradition of Christianity. At Bow Valley, our tradition is we partake in communion each week. I grew up in a church that is similar. We call it a sister congregation in Edmonton to Bow Valley. And ever since I was 12, was baptized at Pine Lake Christian Camp. Right? So now I'm allowed to take communion. Notice how that works, right? Tradition. And every week I would take communion. Now, I've taken communion, I don't know how many times in my life. I don't remember them all. But I do remember certain weeks. I remember coming to the elements and thinking, oh, this was a rough week. This was not a good week. I was not good this week. I could have been much better this week. And I remember thinking, I'm not good enough to do this. I'm not worthy to do this. And somewhere along the way, I realized that is the exact opposite of what this is. See, you do this not to make you good, but we do this to recognize that we never could be. See, this acknowledges the fact that it's only in Jesus and what he did for us that allows us even to whisper something of goodness. And I do this not because I had a great week, but I do this to remind me of the story that I'm a part of, and that hopefully this next week, today, I will be a little bit more open to where Jesus is at and hearing what he wants. And then maybe some goodness will ooze out of me to the people around me. If it's part of your tradition, you're obviously not expected to. But if you would like to partake in the elements, this is your opportunity to do so. And I encourage you that as you do, to just ponder, not the week in the past, but just the week ahead. And just to draw close to Jesus and say, okay, let's start all over, and what does this week look like?